2 weeks ago, Sarah Parcell shared from her experiences in one of the most heavily conflicted regions on earth. Conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians, conflicts between Christians and Muslims, and she challenged us toward building bridges of kindness and respect by seeking to understand more than we seek to be understood. Coincidentally, later that same week, delegates from Brethren churches across the country met in Greensboro, North Carolina, where they spent the better part of 3 days in deliberation and debate, sometimes, I'm sorry to say, seeking to be understood more than they sought to understand. Not always, but sometimes. And who would have guessed that 1 week later our entire nation would be reeling with grief, confusion, frustration, and anger from one tragic headline after another. As first, one seemingly innocent black man in Louisiana fatally shot by white police officers. Then another seemingly innocent black man in Minnesota fatally shot by a white police officer. And finally, 5 police officers in Dallas fatally shot and others wounded, this time by a black man who was subsequently killed following a standoff with surviving police. And then there are the everyday conflicts that don't make the headlines between husbands and wives, parents and children, close friends, acquaintances, co-workers, where once again, all too often, we find ourselves, if we're honest, seeking more to be understood than to understand the other. You know, perhaps it's also true even in our praying to God. Worth thinking about. Well, I'm glad to say we did more than debate at our annual conference of Brethren churches. Each day we also gathered and worshiped around the theme, Carry the Light. Boy, is that needed now as much as ever. And so the question, as followers of Jesus Christ, how can we bring the light of Christ into such brokenness and pain? Similar to Sarah's message 2 weeks ago, I want to suggest that it perhaps starts with listening. I want to suggest actually four ways that we can perhaps help to carry the light of Christ in the midst of conflict, disagreement, or the rawness of the kind of pain that we've seen in our country this past week. The words I want us to think about are the words listen, imagine, connect, and respond. Listen, imagine, connect, and respond. When I say listen, I mean really listen, because we don't always do that so well. I want to encourage us to listen, whatever the conflict, whether it's within a one-on-one relationship, whether it's within a marriage, whether it's parent and child, whether it's co-workers, or whether it's in the type of settings that I've talked about, whether it's church group gathered, whether it's nationwide conflicts. To listen with these acknowledgments. And I'm going to name 5 of them. And I hope you will own all 5 of them. To listen, acknowledging, number 1, that I don't know all the facts. It's pretty much true of any situation. I don't know all the facts. Secondly, what I think I know may not be accurate. Thirdly, it is possible to have accurate information but to interpret it wrongly. Fourthly, when it comes to gathering and interpreting information, I have prejudices. I'd kind of like you to say that with me, but I'll say it again. I just invite you to listen and please own it, because it's true. When it comes to gathering and interpreting information, I have prejudices. What I mean by that are prejudices about whom I trust to tell me the truth, which news service I trust, which source I trust, and if they say it, it's true. If this other one says it, it's not true. That's prejudice. You may feel you have good reasons for that prejudice, and you may have some, but understand and own it, that you accept things as true without checking them out, and you assume that sometimes claims are not true based on the sources. Not only are we prejudiced about whom we trust to tell us the truth, we're also prejudiced about what we are willing to accept as truth. We often already have our minds made up about a situation. Again, whether within a relationship or our national headlines. And we hear one thing, so no, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. So we've already kind of decided. And yeah, that must be right, because that fits what we're willing to accept. Or sometimes prejudice is based on what conclusions will serve my interest. Fifthly, to own that the people I trust to tell me the truth have prejudices of their own. Who they trust to tell them the truth, what they are willing to accept as truth, what conclusions will serve their interests. Can we acknowledge all of that? And try to listen. I did a lot of listening this week through my eyes, reading what other people had to say and trying to listen. Trying not to say, oh, well, this is that kind of person, or this is that party, or this is... From a member of our own congregation, simply a statement vigorously praying for peace in our violent nation. Oh, well, you can't argue with that. No, but we can listen, we can hear it, and we can be silent, and we can let that voice speak to our hearts. There's no judgment there, is there? There's no taking sides. Just the words vigorously praying for peace. We can hear those words. We can listen. Or these words, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. You heard those words before? The speaker's lips have been silenced here in this life, but his legacy certainly goes on and on. They're from Martin Luther King Jr. From another acquaintance, I'm not even sure what her faith position is, where she is in her life in that. It's just an acquaintance. Commented a peaceful protest with the good guys protecting the protesters. And the protest was ambushed by hate. Even in the line of fire, police tried to get the protesters to safety. There's an underlying problem here, and it's on both sides. From another friend, I know a whole lot more about his journey. Said simply, God help us. Protect the police. Protect black men. God save us. Other words I heard, again, from Martin Luther King Jr. Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence is impractical because it is a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends up defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivors and brutality in the destroyers. We need to listen to those words. Another member of our own church community here. Think about this. How would you feel if you were afraid that your children were more likely to be killed by a police officer than by a terrorist? Our society still suffers from the sin of racism. Every area is affected. How can we help schools? How can we help employment, the prison system? And what can we do to change law enforcement protocol? Can we listen to voices from different perspectives? Listening for the truth that each one brings. This one from a television personality, reminding us you can truly grieve for every officer who's been lost in the line of duty in this country and still be troubled by cases of police overreach. Those two ideas are not mutually exclusive. You can have great regard for law enforcement and still want them to be held to high standards. But not every voice was talking about the structures of our culture in a personal, verbal conversation with someone who is here this morning. Question was raised, how does the gospel relate to this? And one suggestion, if you have trusted in Jesus Christ, you don't have to be afraid to die. You can always be ready. A principle not specifically focused on the details and the circumstances, but realizing that for any of us, as tragic as these deaths are, it's a reminder to us. Other words, I think wrongly attributed to Benjamin Franklin, but no one's quite sure who in his place really originated them. Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. These words from a fellow pastor. Beloved, violence, systemic violence or vengeful violence is never right. No, if your enemy is hungry, feed her. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The world feels so full of evil this morning, and I'm praying that we might not be overcome, but might join in the work of overcoming instead. Someday. And one more, excerpts of a response between the two fatal shootings and before the police officers were killed in Dallas. All Americans should be deeply troubled by the fatal shootings of Allen Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Philandro Castile in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. We've seen such tragedies far too many times, and our hearts go out to the families and communities who suffered such a painful loss. To admit we've got a serious problem in no way contradicts our respect and appreciation for the vast majority of police officers who put their lives on the line to protect us every single day. It is to say that as a nation we can and must do better. to institute the best practices that reduce the appearance or reality of racial bias in law enforcement. So even as officials continue to look into this week's tragic shootings, we also need communities to address the underlying fissures that lead to these incidents and to implement those ideas that can make a difference. In the meantime, all Americans should recognize the anger, frustration, and grief that so many Americans are feeling, feelings that are being expressed in peaceful protest and vigils. Rather than fall into a predictable pattern of division and political posturing, let's reflect on what we can do better. Let's come together as a nation and keep faith with one another in order to ensure a future where all of our children know that their lives matter. If I had told you before I read that who said that, some of you would have tuned me out. That was Barack Obama, our president. Whatever side of the political spectrum you find yourself, I hope we can still listen and hear truth and wisdom when it's shared. Listening is so important. Seeking understanding. It's also important that we bring to that our imagination, to be able to put ourselves into another person's circumstances, to imagine what his or her life is like, and to let that impact how we process what's going on. As Jesus said, to relate to others, to treat others, to do unto others what you would have them do unto you. It's hard to do that without imagining and putting yourself in their position and then acting in accordance. It's true in relationships. It's true in a marriage. It's true with parents and children. It's true in the workplace. It's true as we make judgments about headlines. And I use the word connect. We can connect by thinking about experiences that we've had that maybe are a little bit like the experiences of others, but I think there's part of us that as we begin to understand other people a little bit more and feel for them, we long for some kind of connection. An older gentleman who lives right here in Harleysville had his own personal tragedy that he made a connection with national events. And listen to how he put this in perspective. He said, "As I write this, I have tears in my eyes and a big lump in my throat. The TV tells me about the tragic shooting and killing of police in Dallas, carried out by a person with such hate in his heart that he wanted to kill white police officers. How have we come to this? On June 18th, I watched my wife's life pass from her body. In an instant, my greatest treasure was being taken from me, and I prayed and I called 911. God sent 2 angels in blue uniforms. One angel was white and one was black. They brought my Peggy back to me. When I met them a few days later, I couldn't properly tell them how much I loved them and how I could never repay them for saving her. Says I couldn't tell them because I was crying so hard. With God's help, we can rid ourselves of this hatred that's destroying our country and learn to love all people for how they act, regardless of their color." Conversation with one of our own talked about being in a store in this area and being served by a black gentleman, and just in this context, wanting somehow to say something to acknowledge the pain but not being sure what to say, not wanting to just put him in a category, but wanting to make a connection, wanting to show respect. As with most of us, you don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to patronize someone. And so she was kind of struggling with the fact that she didn't end up saying anything. And there was a group of us talking, and someone said, well, you told him thank you, right? Well, yes. Well, maybe that's all you needed to say. And sometimes maybe so. But it's that heart that longs for connection. It's that heart that sees in everyday situations ways that maybe I can contribute to the greater good. Maybe I can be a channel of Christ's light in my actions every day. Sometimes God might give us an opportunity and give us the insight or words to speak, such in this situation. And this time it's someone I don't know, a complete stranger, unlike most of these others. It's a young black lady gave this testimony. She said, and she labeled it feeling hopeful. She says, so this morning I went into a convenience store to get a protein bar. As I walked through the door, I noticed that there were two white police officers, one about my age, the other several years older, talking to the clerk, an older white woman behind the counter. They were discussing the shootings that have gone on in the past few days. They all looked at me and fell silent. I went about my business to get what I was looking for. As I turned back up the aisle to go pay, the oldest officer was standing at the top of the aisle watching me. As I got closer, he asked me how I was doing. I replied, okay, and you? He looked at me with a strange look and asked me, how are you really doing? I looked at him and I said, I'm tired. His reply was, me too. Then he said, I guess it's not easier being either of us right now, is it? And I said, no, it's not. Talk about making a connection. She said, then he hugged me and I cried. I'd never seen that man before in my life. Have no idea why he was moved to talk to me. What I do know is that he and I shared a moment this morning that was absolutely beautiful. No judgments, no justifications, just two people sharing a moment. Talked about listen, imagine, connect. The last word was respond, and these all kind of bleed over into each other, I understand. But I chose the word respond, not react. And I put it at the end because reactions tend to come before we've listened and imagined and connected. But if we've taken time to listen and to imagine and to connect, we're in a better position to be able to respond in a way that is respectful, in a way that is compassionate, in a way that is understanding, and most important, in a way that reflects Christ in us. The question I started with was, how do we carry the light of Christ into the midst of this darkness? And we do it. We do it by listening, by imagining, by connecting. We do it as Paul wrote, or as Peter wrote in one of his letters, to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that's in us to anyone who asks, but to do it with gentleness and respect, to do it with understanding, to build relationship, to listen, to imagine, to connect, and then let that guide us in how we respond. to any situation of conflict, of difference of perspective. A college classmate of mine and a pastor posted something his now adult son wrote. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he stressed the importance of responding and how collectively so often, as he wrote, in my fervor to react, I fail to respond. In needing to be heard, I forget to hear. He says this war of reactions has pitted Black Lives Matter emphasizers against police supporters as if the two were mutually exclusive. And we've heard other voices saying the same thing. He goes on, can we not instead make space for the other, listening in love and working together? Can we not instead seek an end to these tragedies? Can we not instead decry the loss of life, no matter whose life it may be? We are all human, after all, made in the image of God. I suspect God sorrows at each loss. It is easy to point the finger and cry, look what they've done. How much more difficult it is to turn to myself and ask, what will I do? I refuse to react. Rather, I will respond. I will decry this loss of life. I will grieve with those who have suffered. I will pray for reconciliation. I will work for a better tomorrow. I will hope for a day when evil ends. Decry, grieve, pray, work, hope. I will seek to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with my God. May that be our response in every situation we face. May that be our response even when we are largely unaffected, at least directly, by things that go on in our world. To decry, to grieve, to pray, to work, to hope, to seek to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God. I want to leave you this morning not with more words, but with an image. Perhaps you've seen the image. I'm going to ask for the screen and the projector. It's just one small sample of the possibility of connecting after listening and imagining, of connecting and responding, that reminds us of what is possible. And if it's possible in places like this picture will show, it's possible in our communities, it's possible in our homes, in our families, in our churches. May God give us the grace to live this out in every circumstance of life. This was one church's response, a black church's response. To gather around their local law enforcement officers to pray for them. May God's church of every color rise up and follow that lead. Their circumstances are not the same. It's not. I understand that, but may we ask what we can do as instruments of Christ in this world.